In this video, I'm going to be breaking down the project files for this animation. Hey, welcome to a new series of videos that I'm going to be doing on this channel, where I'm going to try and break down some of my project files and show you how I went about achieving certain looks and effects. And hopefully you can learn something new. I'm going to be doing these sorts of videos for all of these animations, with a link in the description to download the project files, so be sure to look out for more upcoming videos. So I created this animation around 2 years ago now, so it might be a little bit messy, or I might have gone about creating things in a different way now. But yeah, here we have it. In its most basic form, this whole animation is broken up into 3 scenes, and if I come up here, we can see I have this main export comp, which is what we have open now, and I have our pre-comps folder with scene 01, 02 and 03, and these have their own pre-comp, and inside here as well we have all the pre-comps that are used to build up the scenes. So yeah, let's jump into our first scene. So in this comp we have the ball bouncing up, it leans back forward, and then it falls down into this little gap here. And the rotation on this is done with these 2 nulls. So the first one controls it leaning back, and then we have this little bit of overlap between these 2, which gives it a nice smooth animation, and then we rotate back forward. And then everything else we see happening is done inside of this composition here. So we have a few things happening in this comp, but it's all pretty simple. So we have our circle shape layer, which is parented to this null object, and then we have our 2 white shapes, and then we have this composition here which has our grid in it. And we're using a mask which is just animated by hand, which masks out the grid from this gap here. But yeah, this is all just like done by hand with some pretty simple keyframes. So we can see it scales up, and it has a little bit of position to give it some overshoot as it comes up and then settles back in place. And I think that's what sells this kind of intro bit, is it all has a nice sense of weight to it, and we can see even on this top shape we have some position which gives it some overshoot, and it kind of like bounces. We can see it like lands and bounces up and then settles. So this the circle is kind of like driving this and like pushes it up. This null object here is basically just 2 position keyframes. So we have it come back here, and then we have position keyframes on our circle shape, which then bring it back forward, and that's pretty much all that's happening with the circle. We have a few other nice things that are going on. So we have this like nice little smear effect, and it has like a little flicker just before it falls down into the hole. So that's just done with this echo effect, which basically copies the shape back in time by however amount we set here. So we can make this longer or shorter by changing that. And then the flicker is just done with a fill effect, which just keyframes the color like that. And then inside this comp is our grid, and can't really see that, but it's basically just a few keyframes that's scaling up and just matching it with what's happening inside this comp. So we can see it better here. The grid is like scaling up like so. And then the last thing that really happens is here is we have some keyframes on the paths of these shapes. So as it's coming down like so, the path is just getting thinner. And yeah, that's pretty much all that's happening in here. So if I come back into the scene 01 comp, we can see all of that together like that. And one more thing to mention about this comp is its size is bigger than our main export comp, which is 1080 by 1080. So this was just basically so I could see what was happening with the rotation, and then once we come back in here we can see these corners here are cut off because we're sort of zoomed in a little bit. So yeah, that's everything for our first scene. So let's close up these and come back out here. So here you can see how I'm transitioning to my second scene with this downward motion, and then we have this sneaky little cut here, and we're basically carrying on this downward motion with the second scene. And one thing I would fix if I was to do it again is this little gap, But that's one thing you can kind of get away with. If you have a piece of animation that is happening quite quick, you can trick people's eyes into thinking this is all one seamless piece of animation when in fact we're actually just cutting to something completely new. So then if I jump into our second scene, you can see that we already have quite a few more layers compared to the first one. So let's start with this first composition here. So this is basically just the ball scaling up and then the other ball bouncing around inside of it. And we have this kind of hierarchy of nulls happening here. So our composition is parented to this first null, and then it's parented to the second one and the third one and so on. And all of these nulls basically have little bits of subtle animation to them, little bits of rotation and scale and position keyframes. So that just kind of builds up and gives it a little bit more, makes it a little bit more dynamic, I guess. And then our composition is a 3D layer and we have a bit of X rotation on it. So here we can see it's leaning back. And we also have some keyframes on this drop shadow, which is basically this bit here, which adds a little bit of depth. So then if I come into this composition and if I play this out, you can see what all those other nulls were doing in our other comp. So this looks quite static compared to what was happening in our other comp. And we have a few little tricks and things going on that help us build up this animation. So let's start with this first layer down here. So this is our ball falling down, and this is basically just a shape with a stroke on it. And I'm using trim paths to basically offset the path down this shape and down into the center. And I also have this echo effect again, which has given us these nice little smears. And then at this point we can see it's cutting away and we have this layer above taking over, which is the circle scaling up. And then we have this layer here, which is another circle with a stroke on it. And I use strokes on these bits here because it's easier to just use a trim paths effect and kind of offset the shape around the path instead of trying to keyframe out like a nice smooth circle. So at this point here, we also have this scaling up and we have like some stroke width keyframes, which is just scaling the stroke up, and also some size keyframes to just match it with the scale of the circle behind it. And using a stroke with trim paths also allows me to keep the shape a little bit longer, so it looks like it has a smear on it as well. So we have it rotating around, and then we have another little cut here, which is transitioning it into a circle shape with a fill on it now. And we're animating this with position keyframes and using these Bezier handles to give it some nice arcs. And again, we're using this echo effect to also add these smears. So here it's animating down, and then we have this null here which takes over, and then at this point here this null takes over too. And I think one thing that sells this little bit here is every time we hit the edge we have this little flash effect. So that is again just done with this fill effect here, and we're just keyframing the color like so. So yeah, that's everything that's happening in this composition. So let's hop back into our scene 2 comp, and we can now move on to this eye section. So before I hop into this composition, I'll just show you what's going on out here. So we have this adjustment layer with a warp effect on it, and this is just basically adding a little bit of detail, warping it up like so. And then this composition here is also parented to this null object, which is scaling it down and transitioning into the next scene. Cool, so let's take a look inside this composition here. So essentially I have a simple eye rig in here, but I'll get into that in more detail in a bit. So let's just go through this layer by layer. So here I have this eye layer, which is this background bit of the eye. And then I have this inside eye comp, which is all the inner bits of the eye. And then this layer here is a duplicate of this bottom one. And I'm using this as a mask for the inside eye comp. So all these bits stay inside the outline of the eye. This is also parented to this layer down here. So I basically use this to do all the blinking. And then that just keeps the inner eye layers masked inside. And then here we have these two nulls, which are basically helping to animate the eye. We have a camera, which is changing the look. And then here we have this adjustment layer with a transform effect on it. So this is basically scaling the width down to 25, so it makes it kind of look like this ball shape, which is carrying on the same shape from this bit here. And then it's basically just scaling up like so. So I went about animating this by having all of these layers here parented to this main eye control, and this is basically giving us this downward motion, and then it comes back up to the center. This is basically carrying on the same motion that we have going on here, and then helping us transition into this eye part. And then we have a few other keyframes down here as well. So at this keyframe here, the eye is getting really thin, and then it's scaling back up into place. And then on both this eye control null and this inside eye comp, we have some position keyframes that are animating the eye to look over here, and then back over, and then back over to the center like so. And you can see when the eye is looking around, it's kind of leading with this smaller circle, and then this bigger circle is lagging behind. And that's where this inside eye comp comes into play. So if we come into here and we set our camera to this custom view, we can see that this iris layer has been moved back in 3D space, which basically gives us this parallax effect. So if I come back here and drag this layer around, we can see that the smaller circle is always looking in the direction that it's pointing at. And also on this layer, I've enabled continuously rasterize, which basically carries through our 3D layers into this comp. So you can see if I turn this off, it loses that perspective. And then one final thing is if I come into here and go back to this active camera, we can see at this last bit here, our pupil starts to shake. And for that, I was basically trying to make it look a little bit scared as it was scaling down into the transition for the next scene. So the way I went about doing that is I added this expression to the position. This is basically wiggling 8 times a second. And then this part here is parented using this here up to the slider control. And then I have keyframe the slider control from 0 to 2.5. So at this point, the pupil starts to wiggle. And then in here we have a few other things going on as well, like some flicker on our layers and some other keyframes on the pupil layer as well. So if I come back to this eye comp and play that through, we can see all that happening there. And I tried my best to give this eye some character, so to make it look a little bit suspicious as it was looking around, and like scaling the eye down so it was like squinting at things. So yeah. So if I come back into the scene 2 comp, one last thing that I want to talk about is how I went about doing these lines in the background. So let's have a look inside this background animation comp. So in here I have all of these shape layers, which are circles with strokes on them. And I've tried to arrange these in this interesting way to create this nice looking pattern. And at the start they all have these scale keyframes to scale them up. And they are also parented to this background null control, which has these 2 rotation keyframes to rotate it around like that. And some of these shapes also have some scale keyframes at the same point to scale up different parts and create this new looking pattern. And the reason for that happening at this point is because it aligns with our circle transforming into the eye. So that basically adds a little bit of extra movement in the background. So on this background animation comp, we have 2 effects. The first one is CC Collider, which basically creates these nice looking psychedelic patterns, and we can use like different mirroring options. And I basically have 2 keyframes on this for the center, which is basically adding this continuous movement in the background. And then the second effect we have on this layer is posterized time, which is basically changing the frame rate to 12 frames per second, which gives us this cool background animation. And when I was creating this, I kind of just winged this effect, but I was really happy with how it came out, and I've used this now on a few of my other social posts as well. So this is what all of that looks like played back. And I think that wraps up everything to talk about in our second scene. So let's close these up and come take a look at our third scene. So again, I'm creating this nice transition from scene to scene by carrying on the same motion. So in our second scene, the eye is scaling down, and then this same motion is carried through as we're zooming out from this grid. And before I go into this comp, let's just talk about what these effects are doing here. So I have a warp effect and a CC lens effect with some keyframes. So this warp effect is just adding a little bit of distortion as we're transitioning, and the CC lens effect is also just adding this kind of like edge distortion. It's quite subtle, but it just basically sells the transition, I think. So let's come and have a look inside our third comp. So all of these individual squares are their own composition, and I basically just duplicated those and arranged them in this grid. And these are all 3D layers. So I also have this camera here, which is being controlled by these two null objects. And these are basically just animating the camera out like so. And then this one here is carrying on that motion out. And there's not really a whole lot else to this. I'm basically doing this flicker kind of transition, this kind of like glitchy transition, by just using a shape layer, and this is just animating on with opacity and then animating off, and then I'm cutting our layers off at that point too. So in each of these comps, these will be either blue or yellow, and I've basically just offset these by just dragging them to like different points. And also I've tried to keep this as organized as I can by changing the color of these layers. So all of these red ones are this first like inner circle, and then all of these orange ones are the next layer, and then so on and so on. And yeah, that's pretty much all there is to this. And then we have this center one, which has a little bit more to it, which is just animating the circle up and then back down. So yeah, that's really all there is to that. So we're just having all of these animate off like so. And then if I come back out here, I basically have 3 layers here to try to loop us back into the start. And this is just a background layer with the same color. And then I have 2 compositions. One is vertical grid lines. So they're just animating on like so, and then same for the horizontal lines. And I basically just took a screenshot of this frame here and then drew on all of our lines to match up with the start. So yeah, there we go. That is how I put this animation together. This video isn't really meant to go through all of the specifics, but I just wanted to show you how I approached each part. But feel free to download the project file in the description and have a deeper dive yourself. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new. The next project I'll be doing a breakdown of is this animation, so stay tuned for that, and thanks for watching.